Good day to you guys, Middernacht here, and today I'm going to give a short overview of the state of Armored Warfare in my opinion. It's currently in the open beta phase. I just want to talk about what I think's good about it, what I think needs to be changed, and just my general impressions of the game so far. I've gotten my first tier 9 tank. I've spent at least a couple hundred hours already playing this. I'm a big fan of it. I like it, and just want to say that I'm not going to be pro either side. I do love the game, but I do think there's a lot that needs to be changed in order for this to be a successful product. The state of MBTs right now is about where they should be. Some MBTs could use a few tweaks. I'll go over those probably in a later video. Right now, I think the biggest problem with Armored Warfare is the player base doesn't seem to understand a lot of the core game mechanics, and I don't know whether this is a fault of the game developers or the player base. I don't feel a lot of things like camouflage, view range, and differing armor types are very well explained, and players that haven't played World of Tanks aren't going to be familiar with this. As Obsidian tries to say, they're not trying to bring in World of Tanks players. They've not explained the tank arcade action game mechanics very well to people new to it. And I think this is a big failing on their part. I suspect they were hoping the community would come out like they did in World of Tanks and make lots of guides and videos, but the game's only been out for a couple months, and the community's not had time to create that base yet. Given time, this will increase, and there will be a lot more community content out there, but it's just not had the time to develop yet, and I think that's a big fault of Obsidian, is not recognizing that. There should have been a wiki, or there should have been more tutorials than just the one. I love the tutorial, it's really well done. Going back to tank classes real fast, so MBTs are okay right now. Artillery seem to still be wishy-washy about what exactly they're for. The devs have said this themselves, so I'm not going to fault them for that. But it seems light tanks and tank destroyers, particularly in higher tiers, don't seem to know where they're at and what they're for, because higher tier tank destroyers such as the Centauro, the B1 Centauro, and the Centauro 120, the LEV 600, and the Striker all seem to be all over the place, and I think the tank destroyer class in general just needs a lot of overhauls. The recent ability of gun suppression is rather useless given the fact that their camouflage is now largely not that great. I think they should lose their ability for the gun suppression, and they should look at the forums for other suggestions of how tank destroyers should be improved. Personally, I think they need something more on the lines of better penetration. I don't know if they're supposed to be able to take out MBTs from the front. I don't know if that's their role, because if it isn't, then they're basically just light tanks with better DPM and wheels. So their role right now is not very well defined. Speaking of light tanks, in lower tiers they seem to know what they're for. Up to the Sheridan, I think they're just fine. And the Bagel Panzer is pretty much an AFV with a slightly bigger autocannon and less view range. I don't like it particularly, but I think it's fine where it is right now. The Stingray 1 needs to be looked at, definitely, because it is worse than the VFM in every way. Almost every way, and it's an actual normal tank, it's not a premium, and that doesn't make any sense to me. This brings up the other issue of premium vehicles themselves. I currently own the MBT-70 Merc, a AMX 10P, a Abbott, so I can't speak for things such as the VFM, but I get the impression the VFM is a little bit too powerful for what it is. It's pretty much the same as the Stingray, except it has more armor, and that's about it. I don't get the VFM. It seems a little overpowered to me. That said as well, the MBT-70 can have ridiculous gains because of its mobility. As it stands right now, the MBT-70 seems way too fast for what it is. I've been able to chase down light tanks and AFVs with that thing. So what's the point of those things and their speed when I could just chase them and kill them in 2 shots with heat shells? I don't know. Shell types is another thing the devs keep changing, and I hope they decide what they want to do with it eventually. Because at the start it seemed that AP shells would do significantly less damage to paper tanks because they'd overmatch and they'd poke a hole straight through and do less damage. They've taken that out, so now you can fire AP and reliably do damage, or you can fire heat and reliably do less damage, because heat shells are not reliable enough to shoot at anything with any armor. Even in higher tiers, heat becomes less useful because even light tanks get things like Cage, ERA, and some APSs can even knock out low velocity heat shells. Even HE shells have been changed in a way that very much resembles Portal Tanks mechanics, and people didn't seem to load many HE shells there. I never load more than 2 in a tank, 2 or 3, because you just never need to fire them because heat kills paper tanks and AP kills everything else. So if the devs could figure out how to make armor-piercing shells do less damage to lightly armored targets again like it used to do, then I'd be very happy with that. I mean, one basic thing they could do is get rid of overmatching on MBTs. Just make it so it's impossible to overmatch on any MBTs at all, or if you do overmatch, you do extra damage. I think that's how it is right now. If you overmatch on MBT's roof and rear armor, you often do an extra like 15-20% damage, it seems, because you're penetrating a heavily armored target in a weak position, and it allows the shell to do more damage. I'm not sure if this actually is a thing, I'm just speculating, but I think that would be a good way of making AP, again, something you want to avoid shooting at lightly armored tanks, because as it stands right now, you can just fire it at everything and you'll do more reliable damage than if you fire heat. Also, HE shells, if they penetrate, don't do as much damage as heat shells, which makes no sense to me. I think they should also be a viable option for shooting at light tanks. If you want to knock out a light tank's crew and do lots of damage, it should be about the same as heat shells, except they can also do more module damage. And that would be another way of making them more viable against lighter targets, because HE shells, I think, tend to be about the same velocity as heat shells, so they're just as hard to hit at medium and long range. It also seems to me that maps aren't designed to allow lightly armored vehicles to have as good a game as MBTs are, because MBTs can push, they can defend, some of them can even spot for themselves if things get a little bit too close, and just renders the point of what are the other classes for when competitively you're going to have teams full of MBTs with few weak spots from the front and a couple scouts. Again, similar to World of Tanks' competitive modes. This brings up another big point, which is map design. The maps don't seem to allow for movement very well. They seem to promote sitting in a good position and just firing from there the entire game until everyone else dies. That seems to be how I have my good games in either TDs or even some MBTs. I go to a good position and I just sit there and snipe things the whole game. And it's rather dull. It doesn't promote fun, exciting, fast-paced, action-based gameplay. And I really wish something could be done about that, because as it stands right now, it's the team that tries to attack dies, and then all the tanks that were smart enough to sit in good positions are then by themselves against like 12 or 15 enemy tanks. And it's just not fun for the rest of us who actually understand how the game works and either know which lanes to push or where to sit for the entire game. Maps either tend to be too closed or too open, and there's not many that have a good mix of them. The terrain also seems to be full of little bumps, and even tanks with gun depression can often struggle to actually aim their gun down on things because the gradients always seem to be at too high an angle. I don't know if this is just to try and make tanks have to expose their entire hulls to shoot, but it does mean tanks with missiles can often sit in hold-down positions and shoot missiles down at stupid angles onto the top of other MBTs. This also makes playing Russian MBTs a little difficult sometimes because they don't have much gun depression, and they often struggle to stay hull down and hide their lower plate, which is how they're meant to be played. You often have to expose the entire tank to shoot with Russian MBTs, and that means showing your lower plate and getting penned over and over again. It seems weak spots like that, even though they can be small, the accuracy of guns in this game is so much more than it is in Mortal Tanks, and you can reliably hit weak spots of Russian MBTs at like 500-600 meters with almost any gun. So having weak spots that are that big on the bottom of your tank just render their armor almost obsolete. And again, this is something I think that needs to be looked at. Either decrease the accuracy of guns overall, or make weak spots harder to hit at longer ranges, because as it stands right now, if an MBT has any weak spots on the front of it, it just gets penned over and over again. It'll bounce occasionally, but only if you manage to stay hull down, and that just means camping the whole game. And again, just like the map design, this game encourages you to sit somewhere the whole game, and in a good position and never move. Another point right now is the matchmaker, which I know the devs have said isn't working, but it's ridiculous because sometimes you'll get in a team and the enemy team will have up to 3, 4, sometimes even 5 higher tier tanks than your team does, or they'll have like challenger platoons and your team has no challengers at all. They'll have AFV platoons and your team will have like 1 AFV. It's really inconsistent, and the matchmaker often decides who wins the game more than anything else. Also, I understand that sometimes the population on the server is low, and if you wait in the queue for too long, you can get into higher tier games. But plus 3 tier or even 4 tier matchmaking is absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know why that's even in the game. I think the game should warn you that if you're in the queue for a certain amount of time, it will say your chances of getting higher tier tanks is increased the longer you sit in the queue, and it should give you about the recommended times to leave and rejoin if you don't want that to happen. Again, it's this thing of explaining the mechanics of the game to players. The patch notes are nice, and they have said that they're mainly there to just give a brief overview and not fully explain every single little thing they changed, because not everybody wants to know that they moved a rock like 2 feet. But some people would maybe want to know that, so why not have a advanced patch notes page every time you put out a new patch, so that advanced players like me and other people can look at them and look at all the little changes, because we're interested in that. Another thing annoying me is how you guys are balancing your vehicles, because right now you look at win rates and that's all you care about. This is something that World of Tanks did as well, and their balancing is very questionable, to say the least. Just because a tank is doing well doesn't necessarily mean it's overpowered. It just means a lot of players who are playing it understand how it works. And it can mean it's overpowered, it doesn't have to mean that. Tanks right now that I would call overpowered are things like the VFM, maybe the MBT-70, the T-90 MS, and higher tier Russian MBTs just get stupid alpha damage pen and DPM, which is just ludicrous. But these small balance changes aside, they'll get changed eventually, and as they add more and more vehicles, one thing Obsidian need to worry about that World of Tanks had a problem with is that when they introduce new vehicles, they need to make sure they don't obsolete older tanks. Because something World of Tanks would do is they'd introduce a new vehicle and it would be a new thing, and then later down the line they'd introduce something else that basically does the same thing. So when you introduce new vehicles, do take into account the older vehicles and balance everything accordingly, which I know is a lot to ask for, but it just means that every tank in the game will remain viable. All those negatives aside, let's look at a few things that I do like about what Armored Warfare has done. The maps tend to be more open and bigger, and even though I've already criticized the gameplay, I do prefer these maps that aren't just all MOBA-sized corridors that make 3 lanes that you have to go down. Some maps can be like that, but I do hope they make more maps that are more open, such as the PvE refinery map. I forget what that one's called. That map's just a big sprawling mess of corners, and why can't we have a map like that with 1 lane on the side for tanks with view range to go have view range battles with? This way it would give light tanks the ability to flank, because there'd be lots of corners and lots of places for things to pop out behind, and MBTs could go brawl at close range, which is what a lot of them like to do. The maps do look very pretty. The foliage and stuff is very nice to look at. It's just very aesthetically pleasing. Just something they need to be careful about is not putting stuff to make it look pretty that also affects the gameplay. The maps might look a lot more realistic and a lot more like actual environments tanks might fight in compared to World of Tanks maps. But again, they need to worry about not putting rocks and trees and bushes in random places that make them completely useless. Particularly, I died at least a couple times because I'm just driving along, like circling a tank or something, and then I randomly hit a rock that's like in the middle of a field for no particular reason. And they need to just put things in places where they make logical sense to have them. Another thing I've not really mentioned yet is PvE. I like it as a concept, but this also has a few problems with it, in that a lot of players who don't like the state of PvP or just don't like PvP in general are playing nothing but PvE, and then when they do play PvP, it makes the game horrible for the rest of us who play a lot more PvP because they don't know how to play the game. Also, MBT seems to be the main vehicle class you want to play in PvE because of how the spawning system now works. Stuff will randomly spawn to your sides and behind you, and if you don't have armor and you have nowhere to run to. You just get shot 2 or 3 times before you can run away. But just to summarize here, overall, I think the game has a lot of potential. I think a few tweaks to a lot of core game mechanics would improve the game vastly, and just encouraging people to make videos and such to help players get better at the game, and more tank guides, and creating more, just raise the skill level. The higher the skill level is, the more fun it'll be for everybody. So thanks very much for watching this far, and if you have any more ideas, comments, leave them down below this video. This has been Mitternacht, your resident tanker, and I'll catch you guys next time. Cheers!